How did the whole issue of redress begin? It began as early as 1977 because that was a centennial year. And we had all kinds of activities across the country. And we had speakers and people beginning to talk about what happened during the war or before the war. And as a result of those discussions, the National Association embarked on a study to seek redress on behalf of the community. In 1988, which was a stimulus, the American government actually established a commission on wartime relocation and internment of civilians. And they did, the commission went across the country, had hearings for close to 2 years, got the data, and they finally prepared a report. And the report is called Personal Justice Denied, but the report also says that Japanese Americans who were sent to concentration camps in the United States should be given compensation of $20,000 for their experience. And so that was done in 1983. So that became the stimulus for our community to begin to push this even further with our government. And mainly because the media kept saying, what are you doing in Canada, when they're following the American experience? And so as a result, in '84, these are pictures of the American concentration camps. In the States, they were called concentration camps because there were barbed wire around the entire facility, whereas in Canada, we call them internment centers because you didn't have barbed wire. It wasn't like a jail, it was in the community. It could be even a town that was abandoned that they used. '84, our National Association of Japanese Canadians has a mandate to seek redress, and these are the things that we wanted. One was acknowledgement. We never used the word apology in any of our documents. We wanted an acknowledgement. That's an admission by the government that they did wrong. We don't want them to just say, we're sorry it happened. Second was some form of compensation. And if you acknowledge, to make it more meaningful, you have to look at the compensation aspect. And the third thing we said, repeal of the War Measures Act, because it was that act that created all of the problems for the community, such as the sale of properties or removal, etc. So that's the mandate we accepted. Initially, there was very low support from the Japanese Canadian community. In fact, they were afraid that by bringing it up, you're going to get backlash, more racism. People said, we finally established ourselves. You're going to create backlash, or you're going to have people being critical of us. And the second part they said to us is, you know, we only have 60,000 Japanese in this country. We're such a small community, we have no political power at all. Why are you doing this? It's going to be futile. But you know, it's interesting because our group that met and pursued this, the main emphasis is that we criticize the government for the internment by saying that the Japanese were never ever consulted. They one day decided to pass this, and that was it. There's no consultation or effort made to contact the community. And we said during the redress process, the most important part of redress is the process, our involvement in trying to resolve the issue, and that was important. In order to get support from our community, we had to do a number of things. We had community meetings across the country, and we would bring in speakers such as Joy Kogawa or David Suzuki and so on, who are prominent members of our community to speak. We had house meetings where we would find someone who's got a bunch of relatives or friends, and we say, can you get them together? And we'll just sit down and talk about their experience. And through those meetings, they began to recognize the importance of having this acknowledged. And that's how we developed sort of the support within our community. The other big thing was the media coverage that we were receiving. There were numerous articles on individuals. There were a number of television programs. I was on Front Page Challenge way back when we first got involved. We had a lot of talk shows across the country. Talk shows are easy to do because they just phone you from wherever. And but it was interesting. Talk shows are an interesting thing because the first usually 5 calls are really negative. They pound you and they get you. And then after that, it sort of changes. And that was the same pattern that we had. Didn't matter where you had the talk show. And I said to the person who was the announcer, and he said, well, that's very common because the ones who are really angry are waiting to get on to say their piece. And that's it. And once that's done, you get the more moderate people who are giving opinions. And usually it shifts. And I was surprised a number of times when someone from my own community would get on and say, I don't support you. Why are you doing this? And you know, you're creating a problem in our country. And aren't you, like some said, aren't you a Christian? And they went on and on. They brought in everything to attack you. But that was an interesting process, really. The biggest conflict in our community was trying to decide whether we should have individual compensation or just community compensation. There are many people who said, we don't want individual compensation. There were and then there were others who said, hold it, we lost property, we lost our lives, we lost everything we had. You know, I as an individual lost. It wasn't just the community loss, it was the individual. And so we struggled over this, but that was a conflict. We had organizations forming within our own community fighting us by saying we would accept what the government is offering, because at the point the government was offering some type of community fund, and they said, well, we would accept it. And so, you know, government plays you against the others as well. Initially, we met with the Liberal government, and basically they weren't, and Trudeau was in power at the time, and he basically said, no, we would not apologize for past errors. And so they were trying to pass a bill one day expressing regret. And again, they bypassed the national organization, but they contacted individuals within the Japanese community to go to Ottawa to hear this expression of regret. We protested when we found out about it, and I remember meeting with Lloyd Axford in Winnipeg, because he's my MP, and was telling him about what was happening. And so they called off that expression. They had the expression of regret, but they didn't bring in all the community people that they had first lined up to do so. But at that point, that's when Mulroney was the opposition leader, and he indicated that as a Conservative government, they would have compensated Japanese Canadians. It was a statement that continued to haunt him for 4 years after he got elected. In June, we ratified the redress brief, and that was the first official request. On November 27, we presented the brief to the Prime Minister. It was an interesting story. I was there with our group in Ottawa. We were having press conferences, and I had this the brief that we were going to give to the Prime Minister. It just so happened that we're standing in Parliament buildings, and the Prime Minister is right there having a scrum. And so in the middle of the scrum, I walked up to him and I said, Prime Minister, I would like you to accept this on behalf of our community. And he took it. And he said, thank you, and that was it. But we actually presented it directly to him, because very often it's hard to do that. Anson Nahara wrote this book, Politics of Racism, and she was the first person to go into the archives to look at the materials that were on the internment that were finally open, because it was a wartime issue that I think for 30 or 35 years, those documents are sealed. No one could look at it. It was finally released. She went in and she found all kinds of documents that showed that the whole internment was unnecessary. There were documents from the RCMP to the cabinet saying there's no need to intern Japanese Canadians. There's another one from the Canadian Army head who said that they're not a threat. You don't have to do that. It was a political action on the part of cabinet eventually to intern Japanese Canadians. And so therefore we feel that it was based on economics, the fact that there's a lot of cry within British Columbia to get rid of the Japanese because they're taking over certain industries. In '85, we conducted, because of this division in our community about individual versus group, we did a survey of our people who were affected, and they came back very strongly that they wanted individual, and there was, but a number of them chose individual and group. And so in the end, we included both as part of our proposal. Very few wanted group only. But that survey helped us because we had more concrete data than organizations saying, I speak for this group and they don't want it, that type of thing. The May 8th, so it's the economic losses study, and this is an interesting situation because when we first started negotiating with the government, one of the ministers said to us, he said, what did you really lose? I shared this story yesterday, and basically we couldn't answer the question. So we decided to undertake a study on economic losses. And initially, we were told it would cost $150,000. We didn't have the money. We couldn't raise that much within our own community, although we did fundraising campaigns. Not everyone supported you, so it was hard to get money. But it was through the good luck and fortune that through Price Waterhouse, they volunteered to do it, to do the study with the understanding if there was ever redress, we would pay them for the study. And by the way, when we did the negotiation with the government, we built that into one of the points of the redress. And so the government paid $150,000 for the study after. The part that's important is that the losses they determined were $443 million, but that was a very conservative figure because they said they cannot measure pain and suffering, for example. How do you quantify that? They couldn't quantify even businesses because they said businesses go through cycles. Even though today it's worth $2 million, tomorrow it could be worth $200,000. So they would not put any value into that. The only thing they could really measure was property. If you had property and that was sold on you and you got so much money, they can determine. And so based on the property, it was $443 million. Oh, I'm sorry, the property, and then it's got lost income because people lost their jobs. And many of them are out of jobs for 4 years. So there's a huge amount. The other part is interesting because we're arguing about education and with the government during our negotiations. And they said that there was a study conducted by one of these exams that they use, a common exam, and they found that the Japanese who were in these internment camps, despite the fact that they weren't in school for 3 to 4 years, maintained the same levels as the Canadians. So that tells you a little bit about our education system, maybe. I don't know. Anyway, they said they really didn't lose that much in terms of, except if they went to school, a lot of them, I know this for a fact, that many of them, they'd be 10 years old in a grade 1 class because they weren't in school. So that was something that did occur. And even myself personally, I was put back in school as well because the first school I went to was all French in St. Agathe, which is the sugar beet farm, and I learned French. I took school in French for 2 years. So when I moved to Winnipeg, I couldn't read English. And so they put me back. In '86, we finally came up with specific proposals. Up to this point, we've been always talking about compensation without putting values to it. And so we set up our proposal indicating that we'd like to seek individual compensation 25 million, community fund of 50, and we call it a human rights foundation. And the reason for that inclusion was the fact that during the time that we were trying to get funds to do our study, we asked the government for a grant, and they refused us. And the refusal was based on the fact of, why would we give you a grant for a project that you're going to use against us? So they wouldn't support it. That's when we realized that really small groups have no place to turn. Where do you go to get funds to do research? Where do you go to get funds to educate people and publicize when you, as a small community, you don't have the resources? And that's when we talked a lot about was, listen, sure, that any other groups that are in a similar situation to us would have some resources. And so the foundation was initially based on the fact that it would help those groups who really couldn't get the resources. And so that's how we looked at that. And then changes to the War Measures Act that I've mentioned already. In July '87 was a turning point. That's when we met with David Crombie, who was a minister at the time. And he said, basically, either you take what we're offering, which was a community fund of $12 million, or the negotiations is over. And we walked away from the table at that point, because we could not accept their offer. And so then we decided as a group that we have to change our strategy. Up to now, we've been meeting with the government and our community and basically trying to work something out. It wasn't working. And so we got together and said, we have to include other people. And so we set up a foundation, not a foundation, but a coalition of for Japanese Canadian redress. And we invited other Canadians to join us. And Justice Tom Berger out of BC became the honorary chair. And then we had people like Joy Kagawa, who contacted the artists in the community, the writers, so Pierre Burton and June Caldwell, and all of them joined in. And we had mayors of cities who signed on, many politicians, a lot of academics. But we also got strength from civil rights groups that supported us, Aboriginal organizations, the unions of the major unions of Canada. Bob White was the United Steelworkers or Auto Workers at the time. He sent us a note. Jean-Claude Perrault. They all joined in to support us, as well as all the major churches in Canada signed on to support. And what we were asking them is that they support us in a negotiated redress settlement. We didn't say we wanted your support for all of our proposals. We said all we want is you to support us so we have a negotiated settlement. In other words, a settlement that is satisfactory not only to the government but to us as well. And that's the process that we wanted people to support. That was easier for them to support. I know that I talked to even people, politicians, they said, if you were asking us to support individual compensation, we would not do it. Because of certain principles they may have, they said, but we can support negotiated settlement. If you're satisfied, we're satisfied. All the opposition leaders agreed to that. And I remember one day we were sitting at Ed Broadbent's office. This is in January '85. The government, after our series of negotiations, and they weren't getting anywhere, decided that they would pass a bill themselves without our permission. And so we're sitting in the office of Ed Broadbent, and he gets, his aide comes in, and he says, I have a note for you. And he looks at it, and he said to me, have you agreed to this? And I said, what? He said, there's going to be an announcement in the House tomorrow expressing an apology. I said, hold it. We haven't even talked about that. And finally, and what happened is that the House leader had to get permission so they could introduce it. And Ed Broadbent said, no, we're not supporting that at all. Sent them back. It never came up, but they did that twice. And we happened to be in Ottawa both times around the time that happened. But it was so uncanny that you're sitting there and you get this note just exactly at the same time. After we set up this coalition, we decided to have a march in Ottawa where we had many of the coalition supporters speaking. And so this is where the different civil liberty groups in Canada spoke. And we marched on Parliament Hill. And David Suzuki was one of our speakers as well. But this is the first time that Japanese Canadians ever marched anywhere in protest. And we had a lot of criticism from our own community in setting this up. I had threatening notes from people saying, you're not even Japanese, you don't even think like Japanese people do, we would never do this type of thing. I said, but we're Canadians, and this is the way Canadians act sometimes. So we continued. Best thing we did, because in the end we had national coverage, and shortly after this the government changed their tune. And by that time, Jerry Wiener was now the minister. We went through 4 ministers during the 4 years. He was the last minister, and I remember him calling me after the rally. He says, you know, we'd like to meet again. And basically I said to him, well, we'll meet as long as we can discuss individual compensation, because at that point they would not accept that and they wouldn't even consider it. And he came back and he said, the Prime Minister, I've talked to him, he wants this issue resolved, everything's on the table. And we said, if everything's on the table, we'll meet. And we did meet in August of 1988 in Montreal, and after 2.5 days we came to an agreement with the government in terms of the settlement. An official acknowledgement and apology was made by Prime Minister Mulroney in the House of Commons with unanimous approval. All parties supported and all parties stood up and talked about it. There was a press conference following that which gave the terms of the redress agreement. This is a photo of us where we're signing the agreement, and after the signing with the Prime Minister there. Why did this happen? We always say that we were very fortunate that the timing was right. Maybe some other time it would not happen, but the fact that there was a US bill signed on August 10th in the same year, President Reagan signed a bill and it officially gave Japanese Americans $20,000 individual compensation. So that became a precedent. The other thing that was there is the possibility of a fall election. I know the Prime Minister in his initial, when he first came into power, said he would resolve this issue, and time was running out. And so there was this feeling that the timing was pretty good for him to reconsider. They also did national polls just prior to it to see what was the pulse of Canadians, and the majority of Canadians supported redress. And I remember when I met with the first minister on redress, he told me they had conducted the poll, only 20% of Canadians supported it. In this one, it was over 70. So you can see the shift and what happened. And the other thing is that there were changes in cabinet. In our government system, the cabinet plays a very important role. And if you have cabinet people who aren't supporting certain things, it's hard for even the Prime Minister to push it through unless they have the law of power. The problem here was that one cabinet minister was violently opposed to redress. And he was a minister for national defense, or for veterans affairs. And he was violently opposed because the veterans as a group did not support us either. And while he was in cabinet, Mulroney had a very difficult time getting discussion on redress. In, I think, April, this minister became ill. And he went into a hospital. He had to drop out of cabinet. And so I think that allowed the Prime Minister a little more flexibility to begin to move, because it was shortly after that changed 180 degrees. And I told this story the other day, and you know, it's informal information, and I'm not too sure how true it is, but one of the aides told me that on the day that this announcement was going to be made, an aide was sent to this person's hospital room and had him sign a letter indicating he supported redress. Just, I think, as a caution. And the government also did other things. They met with the veterans group before, let them know that there was going to be this announcement, and they wanted no reaction from them. But in exchange for that, they received a low increase in their pension. So you can pay your way in. And especially with other ethnic leaders, they were called in and they were told that this announcement was going to be made, because a friend of mine was at that meeting. He phoned me, and one night he says, you know what, you're in, you're going to get redress. And I said, what? He said, well, we had a meeting and they were doing a briefing and they were told that they were going to move ahead, because they wanted assurance from these groups that there wouldn't be any negative reaction. So all of that was staged, and this happened. And what's the impact on our community of redress? Well, one of the things is that many people felt guilty, that they felt that they were at fault for what happened to them, and they took blame for it. And as a result of this acknowledgement, that lifted their guilt. In other words, we weren't at fault. And that's an important thing for the community, because people carry that, not knowing why it happened. And Japanese people are very strong in respect for law and order. So if a politician says something, they respect and they believe it. And so, and at the beginning, we had a difficult time, because many of the seniors said, look, the government did that, pass a law, you have to listen to them. Don't argue. Whereas the second generation, third generation people say, hold it, you know, that's violating my democratic rights. I can speak out. But the senior people said, no, you don't speak out. So that was a real dilemma within our community at the beginning. It also became a precedent for many other redress settlements. I remember at the time we did this, and the minister, there's an article the day after saying, this is a unique, historic event. It will not be a precedent, to assure other Canadians that it's not going to lead into other issues. But following that, many groups use it as a model. In fact, our situation model has been used for even the Aboriginal residential school, because I met with Phil Fontaine and we went through this whole thing with the Japanese, and he liked the model, because when they were negotiating, the most the government were prepared to give to Aboriginal residential people were just compensation for sexual and physical abuse. That was the extent. No one else. And so I spoke to a group of 1,500 in Vancouver with regard to the importance of the entire group being recognized, because they all went through the experience. Not necessarily physical sexual abuse, but of their culture and their rights being violated. And so they bought into it, and they said, that's what we're going to do. And they pushed for that, and eventually that's what they got. And so I was very pleased in the end that that worked out that way.